Turn to 2 Kings chapter 24. In this installment of the Suffering and Deliverance series, I want to go back in time just slightly and cover a king named Jehoiachin. We had just got through the book of Jeremiah and looking at all of the deliverances that Jeremiah experienced from the Lord. And right at the end of the book, there is just the last 4 verses give us a little story, concluding story about what happened to King Jehoiachin that had been taken captive to Babylon many years before that Nebuchadnezzar finally conquered the city of Jerusalem. Now Jehoiachin was a king of Judah, and he was an evil king of Judah. He was the king that was the king before King Zedekiah. That was the king that we looked at here the last couple of weeks, that wouldn't listen to Jeremiah and ended up being having his eyes gouged out and taken to Babylon and all those things. So anyway, in 2 Kings 24, verses 8 and 9, this tells us a little bit about Jehoiachin. It said, "Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And so Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his stead. And the king of Egypt came not any more out of the land, for the king of Babylon had taken from the..." Okay, I didn't want to go that far. So Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his stead. That's all I wanted from that point and forward. Let me see here. I wanted verses 8 and 9. That was pertinent, but what I really want is verse 8 and 9. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. So he was just a young whippersnapper, and his reign didn't last very long. And I'll show you the reason for that. Let's continue to read. And his mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. That's why his reign only lasted 3 months. That's not a very long tenure in office. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. He did evil. Well, what happened to him was the Lord sent in Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the scourge in God's hand, the rod in his hand, and he besieged Jerusalem, and he took Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin surrendered to him, and Jehoiachin ended up being taken captive to Babylon for a long time, for 37 years. We'll look at that here in just a second. In 2 Kings 24, 10 through 18, it says, And at the time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, and his mother, and his servants, and his princes, and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. That would be in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And you say, well, why would he go out there with his mother? Because he's 18 years old. He's still a kid. You need his mom to go out there and help him out. You know, I think it says in Ecclesiastes, woe unto a nation when their king is a child. You don't want a king. You don't want a child king reigning over. Your kids don't have any sense yet. You got to live a few years before they have enough wisdom to reign. But anyway, in verse 13, and he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths, 1,000, all that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. Now this was like a pre-captivity, because he took the rest of them. He took a lot of them at that time, but he took the rest that remained, except for those few poor that he left, we read about that in the days of Zedekiah. But so there was a kind of a dual conquering of Jerusalem here and a dual exile. So he ended up being there, as I said, for 37 years in Babylon. And after 37 years, a new king had come along, a new Babylonian king, and he released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him, and he placed him on a throne above the other kings of Babylon. Turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 52, verses 31 through 32. This is what I was making reference to at the end of the book of Jeremiah. So Jehoiakim had been carried away captive, and then Zedekiah was set up in his place. And you can see that just in you don't need to turn there, but in 2 Kings 24:17 and 18, we see that Zedekiah then was made king in the stead of Jehoiachin. And then we know what happened with him. Well, during the time that Zedekiah was king, and it was quite a few years, Jehoiachin was in prison in Babylon, and for a long time after that too. Jeremiah 52 and verse 31. And it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, in the 25th day of the month, that evil Merodach, now that's actually his name. That's evil is not an adjective there. That was part of his name. I actually had an old pastor in the church that I grew up in. His name was Evil Sizer, which was I think if I was a pastor, I might change my name. But anyway, he was a nice guy, but that was his name. But anyway, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him forth out of the prison, and spake kindly unto him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. Now, I don't know why this is. It doesn't say. But here this guy has been a prisoner for 37 years, and he's a king of a foreign nation that had rebelled against Babylon, right? So he's not exactly in their, on their good list or something like that, on their good side. And for some reason, this king takes him out of prison and sets him over the princes of the kings of Babylon, which is kind of odd. And then he was fed by the king all the days of his life until he died. Verses 33 and 34. And changed his prison garments, and he did continually eat bread before him all the days of his life. As for his diet, there was a continual diet given him of the king of Babylon, every day a portion, until the day of his death, all the days of his life. So, you could say the latter end of him was better than the beginning. Now, there's some lessons that we can learn from this. Now, there's not a ton said about him, but just in this little bit of information that there is given, there are actually a number of lessons, 8 of them. Lesson number 1. There are harsh and long-lasting consequences for sin. Here was a guy that reigned for 3 months. He was an evil king, reigned for 3 months and did evil. And he suffered in prison for 37 years. It doesn't take much time to sin, and the punishment can last a long time. How many guys in a fit of rage murdered somebody and spend the rest of their life in prison, right? That happens. So you always want to be really careful and keep yourself in check, because one foolish move can have long-lasting consequences on you. All right, lesson number 2. God is merciful to the just and to the unjust. Turn to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 45. And we'll see here what Jesus said about how God treats all men, good and evil. He does good to all of them. Matthew 5 and verse 45. Jesus said, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh his sun, that's S-U-N, to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. He's not talking about sending floods and destruction upon the unjust. He's talking about sending them rain in due season for the harvest, right? For the replenishing of the earth. He makes the sun to rise. He gives the sun, which is Solomon said, it's a wonderful thing to behold the sun. He gives both the righteous and the wicked a beautiful sunny day, and he gives them rain to grow crops on the earth, to sustain us. He does that for the good and the bad. So just because you see somebody being blessed of God doesn't necessarily mean they're a good man. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're, one of God's elect and that He's pleased with them. He may not be. He may just be sending rain on the unjust just because He chooses to be nice to evil people sometimes. You never want to look at somebody and say, well, he never submitted to the gospel. He never joined the church. He never got baptized. He never, he just does whatever he wants. He never forsook his foolish and sinful ways, and yet everything's going wonderfully for him. Well, he could be an unjust man that God's just giving some rain and sunshine to for a short season here in life, and it won't go well with him in the end. So you always want to just fear God and do what He says, and don't worry about what happens to other people, whether they're blessed or whether they're not. It doesn't matter. You just do what God says, and God will take care of you. All right, lesson number 3. God will have mercy on whom He will have mercy. Because here's this evil king. It doesn't say what he did. It just said he did evil in the sight of the Lord, but he was a bad king anyway. And yet, later on in his life, God chose to have mercy on him. Romans chapter 9 and verse 5. I mean, who do you suppose was the reason that king, evil Merodach, just decided, I'm just going to let Jehoiachin out of prison. I'm going to bring him up here, I'm going to feed him every day and set him over the kings of Babylon. Who made him do that? Why did he do that? Well, the king's hand is in the hand of the Lord, right? The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, He turneth it whithersoever He will. The Lord had mercy on that man, on Jehoiachin, for some reason. We don't know why. Romans chapter 9 and verse 15 says, For He saith, this is God, For He saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. That's what you call the sovereignty of God. It is God's prerogative whom He chooses to have mercy on. And if it wasn't, it wouldn't be mercy. If God didn't choose whom He showed mercy to, it's not mercy. Because if He doesn't choose whom He shows it to, and if He's obliged to show mercy to certain people because they do certain things which merit His mercy, it is not mercy by definition, because mercy by definition is kind and compassionate treatment when severity is merited or expected. That's what mercy is. So if God has mercy on whom He has to have mercy, it's not mercy. Right? It's an obligation. It's discharging a debt. God has mercy on people that don't deserve His mercy. That's why it's called mercy. And He does it on whom He will. And some people He just decides that He'll have mercy on, eternally speaking. Some He doesn't. Some people He decides He'll have mercy on, temporally speaking. Some He doesn't. David commits adultery, lies about it, murders somebody to cover it up, and the Lord covers his sin. Uzzah reaches his hand up to steady the ark so it doesn't fall on the ground, and the Lord strikes him dead. Well, that's not fair. Well, take it up with God. He has mercy on whom He will have mercy, and has compassion on whom He will have compassion. So, don't presume on His mercy. I'll say, I'm probably like David. I can get away with some stuff. You might be like Uzzah. You never know. Lesson number 4. God can move men to have mercy on us and show us kindness for no apparent reason. Now, unless there was some more information there that we're just not told, it appears to me that there's no apparent reason. This king, I mean, it wasn't like they were buddies. They knew each other from, he's a new king in Babylon. He probably wasn't even born by the time when Jehoiachin was taken captive by the former king. I mean, why would he have taken him out of there? We don't know. I mean, as far as we can tell here, there was no apparent reason. He just did it because he wanted to do it for some reason. And just remember that God can have mercy and kindness on us for no apparent reason. You may look at your circumstance and say, there's just no reason that this is going to change. I can see no reason why this is going to get any better. Jehoiachin had no reason why he was going to get out of prison. He just did because God had mercy on him. So just because you can't see a possible reason why you might be delivered from something you're suffering from, God might deliver you anyway, just because He wants to. Lesson number 5. Sometimes God will let us suffer for a long time before He delivers us. 37 years. That would be like me going to prison when I was 2 and getting out now. That's a long time. It's a long time. So just remember, when you're suffering, well, it's called long suffering for a reason. It means you suffer long. Sometimes God allows us to suffer for a long time. But don't give up and don't lose heart. Don't lose faith. Remember Jehoiachin. And he was even a bad guy and didn't deserve it. And the Lord had mercy on him. So just keep on hoping and having faith that the Lord will deliver you. Lesson number 6. When deliverance finally comes, it often comes very quickly. That man sat there in prison for 37 years. Day after day. And I'm sure it was not a fun place to be. It was probably miserable. Probably eating a bunch of slop and probably dark and dreary and depressing. Day after day after day. And one day, it's over. One day, it's over. And this happens a lot. Sometimes deliverances, do happen slowly over time, and maybe you get better from an illness, and it takes a long time, and it could be years, and you finally get better. But sometimes deliverances come immediately. I'll give you 3 examples. Turn back to Genesis 41 and verse 14. Joseph, we looked at him earlier in this study, a long time ago. Joseph was put in prison unjustly because the Potiphar's wife accused him of trying to commit adultery with her, trying to rape her. And Joseph was put in prison, and he sat in prison for a long time, and then all of a sudden, one day, it ended. And it was a mighty, miraculous deliverance. Genesis 41 and verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. He went from being in a dungeon to standing before the king of the mightiest empire in the world at that time in one day. One day. And not only did he go stand before the king, he became the prime minister of Egypt. He went from being in a dungeon to being the prime minister of Egypt in one day. Verses 40 through 44. This is Pharaoh speaking to Joseph after he had interpreted his dream for him. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. From the dungeon to the throne in one day. That's why I say it. When sometimes you can suffer for a long, long time, and then one day it all changes. One day it's over. Another example was Israel. They had been in bondage and slavery in Egypt for 215 years. Turn to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 31. Exodus 12, 30 through 33. I believe we covered this in this series as well. It's been so long I can't remember half the stuff we covered. But we basically, if there's a Bible character in the Bible and there's a story about him, chances are it's covered in this series because God has been known to deliver His people. And we've been looking at all of them. Exodus 12, Exodus 12, 31 through 33. I was at Exodus chapter 31. Let's go back to 12. Exodus chapter 12, 31 through 33. So Israel had suffered for 215 years. They'd been under hard bondage. When Moses went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, instead of letting them go, Pharaoh made their bondage even worse, right? He made them get their own straw and to make the bricks and all that. Things were really, really bad. And then the Lord sent all these plagues. 10 plagues, and it took until the 10th plague, when he just totally destroyed the entire land of Egypt. This is what a fool Pharaoh was. And finally the 10th plague comes along, and Pharaoh loses his firstborn, and all the nation of Israel, Egypt, loses their firstborn. And Pharaoh finally had enough. And after all those years, hundreds of years of slavery, and all that whole generation of people, they had lived their whole lives in all this misery and all this bondage. And it ends in one day. Verse 31, and he, that is Pharaoh, and he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as ye have said. Also take your flocks and your herds, as ye have said, and be gone, and bless me also. I like that. Be gone and bless me also. Say a prayer for me, because I'm in a bad way here, Pharaoh says. Verse 33, and the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We be all dead men. When it happens quickly sometimes. Verses 39 through 41. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. You ever wonder why the Passover was the feast of the unleavened bread? You ever wonder why we don't use leaven, yeast, in our bread for communion to this day? You know why that is? It is because Israel had to leave Egypt in such a hurry that they didn't have time to leaven their bread. That's why. And that's why the Lord established the Feast of Unleavened Bread as a memorial of Him taking Israel out of Egypt in such haste that they didn't have time to leaven their bread. That's truth. That's why we don't have leaven in our communion bread. Furthermore, leaven represents sin and wickedness. I mean, there's other spiritual reasons for it too. But quite naturally, the reason why we don't have it is because the Lord's Supper was instituted on the same night the Passover was eaten, and the Passover was eaten with unleavened bread. That's why we eat unleavened bread for the Lord's Supper. And the reason why Jesus was eating unleavened bread on the Passover 1,500 years after Israel left Egypt was because the Lord took them out of there so quickly they didn't have time to leaven the bread. Isn't that something? Verse 40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Let me just briefly say this. I did a video blog about this not long ago. It says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel, comma, who dwelt in Egypt, comma, was 430 years. The children of Israel didn't dwell in Egypt for 430 years. The children of Israel sojourned for 430 years. The people that sojourned for 430 years also happened to be the same people that dwelt in Egypt for 215 of those 430 years. They sojourned. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were all sojourners. They didn't have homes of their own. They didn't own land of their own. They were all sojourners and pilgrims. They did so for 430 years. It was 430 years from the time that the promise was made to Abraham until the giving of the law. And you can read about that in Galatians. 215 of those years, Israel was in Egypt. Now the NIV, why this is really important, is the NIV says, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. And that's a bald-faced lie. They did not live in Egypt for 430 years. They lived in Egypt for half that amount of time. That is an internal contradiction which shows that that book is not the Scripture. It's not of God. It contradicts itself. Anyway, verse 41. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the self-same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. They went out in haste. And you know the reason for that? Because 430 years prior to that, God had said it was going to happen. That's why. The Lord prophesied to Abraham. He said that they would evil entreat his seed for 400 years. That would have been about 30 years after the promise was made. Anyway, the point was, they suffered for a long time, and then in one day it all changed. But then I was thinking about another example of this. This will be pertinent to us, or could be pertinent to us, depending on how long we live. In Revelation 20 and verse 9, and we'll get to this. This will be the concluding part of this series when we get there one of these days. But things are going to, evil men and seducers are going to wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived, and things are going to get worse and worse and worse. The devil's going to be loosed, and I think he already is. I think he has been for a while. He's going to gather together all the nations together against the people of God. He's going to go out in Revelation 20 and verse 8, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. The devil's closing in. The government is getting more and more totalitarian. And the saints are hemmed in, and they're all surrounded, and it looks like it's over. There's nothing more we can do. We're all going to be slaughtered. And it changes in one split second. And fire came down from heaven, from God out of heaven, and devoured them all. Yeah, the saints suffered for a long time, and then in an instant, it's over. Revelation 22 and verse 12. Remember what Jesus said? He said, and behold, I come quickly. That doesn't mean he's going to come 5 seconds after John penned the book of Revelation. It means when he comes, he's going to come suddenly. He said in a parable that he was as a ruler that had gone into a far country to receive a kingdom and came back a long time later. So when Jesus went to receive the kingdom, when he went to heaven, he comes back a long time later. But when he comes back, he comes quickly. It happens like lightning. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work shall be. So yes, when deliverance finally comes, it often comes very quickly. All right, lesson number 7. The Lord can bring men out of prison to reign. This is a pretty obvious lesson. This is basically just what happened. I got a verse for you, though, in Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 14. Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 14. It says, for out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. And sometimes the king's kids can become poor, and sometimes the Lord can take somebody out of prison and make him reign. He did it to Jehoiachin. He did it to Joseph. And he basically took Daniel out of the lion's den, which is kind of like a prison, a really scary one, and made him second in command of Babylon. Right? He can take people out of prison and make them reign. So just remember that. No matter how bad it gets, you could even literally be in prison, and you never know what your next station in life might be. No matter how low we get, the Lord can raise us up to very high places. This is lesson number 8, the final lesson for this part. Psalm 113, 7 through 9. Psalm 113, 7 through 9. As Christians, we ought to adopt the attitude that entrepreneurs have. Because entrepreneurs fail and fail and fail, but they always believe this one is going to be the one. This one's going to be the one that takes off. This is going to be the business that succeeds. And we ought to be like that too. We ought to believe, what? The Lord is going to take care of me. He is going to prosper me. He's going to make sure that my needs are met. He's going to make sure that things go well with me. The just man falleth 7 times and riseth up again, we're told in Proverbs. Psalm 113, verses 7 through 9. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust. He lifteth the needy out of the dunghill. This is Jehoiachin, essentially. That he may set him with princes, even with the princes of his people. He maketh the barren woman to keep house, and to be a joyful mother of children. Praise ye the Lord. He literally raises the poor out of the dunghill and sits them with princes. Happened to Joseph, it happened to Jehoiachin. And it can happen to you too. You can be in a really, really low situation, and the Lord can raise you up and exalt you. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, the Scripture says. All right, now let's move on to the next characters that we're going to look at that suffered and were delivered by God, and that is 3 men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were children of the captivity. You remember when we looked at, remember King Zedekiah and King Jehoiachin? In both of their reigns, Nebuchadnezzar took a bunch of captives from Jerusalem to Babylon. Well, among those captives were these 3 boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They weren't named that. They were named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, I believe. That was their Hebrew names. Their names were changed. So they were children of the captivity, and they served in the government of Babylon because they were wise and diligent young men. Well, anyway, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he makes this enormous image of gold. I'm just going to jump right into the middle of the book of Daniel. I'm not going to give you all the information bringing us up to this point. In Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar makes this gigantic image of gold. And I will show you here in just a second where he probably got the idea for this. In Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. This was an image, which is an artificial imitation or representation of an external form of an object, especially of a person, or of the bust of a person. Such an imitation in the solid form, a statue, effigy, sculpted figure, often applied to figures of saints or divinities as objects of religious veneration. So when it says that he made an image, he made a giant statue. Okay? Could have very well have been of himself. It doesn't say that specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit if it was an image of himself that he wanted everybody to bow down and worship. Now, he likely got this idea from the image that he saw in a dream that he had Daniel interpret for him here in the previous chapter. In this dream, he sees this huge image, and its head is of gold, and then its arms and chest are of silver. Was it silver, I think? Yeah. And then brass. Its belly was of brass. Its legs are of iron. So it was made out of these 4 different metals. They represented 4 different kingdoms. The head of brass was Babylon. Then the silver was the Medo-Persians, which took over after them. Then the brass, the belly of brass, was the Greek Empire, which took over after the Medo-Persians. And the legs of iron mixed with clay was the Roman Empire. And I've been over this before with you in different sermons. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar was this head of gold. But let's just look at Daniel 2:31 through 33 first of all. It says, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. And the image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron, and part of clay. And then down in verse 36 through 38, we see that Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, his kingdom represent this head of gold represent Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, their king. Daniel 2:36 through 38. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. The Lord of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. Now that would puff any proud fool up. He sees this dream with this image, and it's this huge colossus, and these different parts of it represent the different kingdoms, and the top one and the most valuable one, the head of gold, is Nebuchadnezzar. And so I don't think it's probably a stretch for Nebuchadnezzar to think, I could make me one of those. As a matter of fact, I'll make the whole thing of gold. As a matter of fact, the whole thing's going to represent me. Forget about the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, which he didn't even know about. A lot of them, they were a long time in the future. Forget about them. This iron mixed with clay, that's ugly. We're going to make the whole thing out of gold, and it's going to represent me. That's probably where he got the idea. Now, this image was enormous. It was 60 cubits. So there are 60 cubits. That's 3/20, which is 60. And it was 6 cubits wide. So 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. A cubit's about 1.5 feet. So you're talking 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. So that's quite a statue. Can you imagine how much that thing cost? I assumed it was probably overlaid with gold. It wasn't solid gold. If it was solid gold, that would be... take all the gold in Fort Knox to build that thing and then some, probably. So anyway, I don't even think there is any gold in Fort Knox. But if there was any gold in Fort Knox, it would take all of it to build that statue. 90 feet by 9 feet. So, once he gets the statue builded, now it's time for some worship. I mean, he's not going to build it for nothing. So he calls all the rulers of Babylon to attend the dedication of this golden image which he made. Verse 2. Daniel 3:2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, and the judges, and the treasurers, and the counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. They had quite a big government in Babylon there. You got all these different officers, and he calls them all. And Babylon at this time was a world empire. The Lord had told him that he had made him king over all the peoples of the earth. And he calls them all from these posts, these outposts all over the place, all these foreign nations that Babylon had conquered, and they all come to the dedication of this image. You know, we even have idolatrous, evil things like this happening today. You ever heard of that tunnel over there in Switzerland? I don't remember what the name of it was. It wasn't that many years ago. It was within the last probably definitely not more than 10, probably 5 years. It's not been that long ago. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, they dedicated this, did I say temple? I meant tunnel. Did I say temple? Tunnel. Okay, tunnel. That's what I meant. They made this tunnel in Switzerland. And they dedicated this tunnel. And it was this satanic program that they put on. And people are doing all this dancing, these people dressed in like tighty-whitey underwear and all this really weird stuff and all this satanic imagery and symbolism. Go look it up. I'm not making this up. Just go look it up. Look up satanic ceremony Switzerland tunnel. Guarantee you'll find it. And it's very, very, very bizarre. A lot of satanic imagery and weird, really weird stuff. So anyway, there's nothing new under the sun. So he calls all these rulers to this dedication. And they all came, and they all stood before it. Verse 3. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. All except for 3. There was 3 people that were conspicuously absent. They either weren't there or they didn't bow down, one of the two. And that was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were advisors to the king. Obviously, they would have been among these rulers that would have been called to be present at this thing. And furthermore, it was all the people anyway, regardless if you're a ruler or not, were demanded to worship this thing, as we'll see in just a second. But these men were advisors. They should have been there right alongside the rest, and they were not. Look at Daniel 1. I'll just show you that they were advisors to the king. Daniel 1, 19 through 20. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their names were changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even until the first year of King Cyrus. So these 3 would have been among these rulers, but they didn't show up because they weren't going to partake in idolatry. they were set over the affairs of Babylon. We can see that in the last verse of chapter 2, verse 49. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So no doubt they should have been there, but they weren't. They either weren't present or they didn't bow down, one of the two. Verse 12 of chapter 3, Daniel 3:12. We'll get to this in a second. I'm just jumping ahead here just briefly. It says, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So they weren't going along with the program. Now that's a pretty hard act to do when all the rest of the rulers and all the government officials and all the people, everybody's there, but they're not going along with it. The peer pressure would have been intense for them to attend this dedication and worship the image along with the rest of the rulers. Notwithstanding, they would not go along with the crowd, as the rest of the story will reveal. They were following the principle in Exodus 23 and verse 2. When the Lord told Israel, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. It is evil to worship an idol. It's evil to bow down to a statue. And they were not going to follow, even if it was the entire rest of the nation, they were not going to follow that multitude. Now I've heard people say, and I think this is ridiculous and absurd, I've heard people say that Daniel was right along with the rest worshiping the idol. I don't believe that for a second. Daniel, stood up strong just a couple of chapters later. I don't think that at all. Daniel was second in command of the entire empire. So he could have been exempted from this. He could have been standing right there next to Nebuchadnezzar, not part of the lower rulers that were all called to do it. Or he could have been on business in who knows what province in the empire. I mean, there's all kinds of explanations as to where Daniel could have been and why he wasn't singled out with these other three. But I don't believe for a minute that Daniel was worshiping that idol. There's certainly no evidence in the scripture of that. So all the people of the empire were commanded to fall down and worship the image when they heard an orchestra of music playing. Daniel 3:4-5. Then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down to worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down to worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. I didn't mean to get verse 6. We'll get to that in a second. So they call out and they tell everybody, when you hear the sound of all these musical instruments, you bow down and worship. The musical instruments were used to get their attention and to stir their emotions in order to prompt them to worship the idol. Music has often been used to entice people into false worship. I got a great quote from Matthew Henry about that later. Music is used to get people into moods and state of minds to do all kinds of crazy and insane things. Like all these people that were killed at that concert. I forget, Travis Scott, I think's the guy's name or something. I don't even know who he is. Some rap artist, I guess. But anyway, all those people, it wasn't long ago here, a month or so ago, they were all killed at this concert, trampled. And there's a lot of speculation about what was going on there. But anyway, there's all this satanic imagery at this thing too. You can see pictures of when you went into the whatever it was, some kind of a like a sports stadium or something, wherever they had this thing, great big satanic stuff when you walk through the door, symbols of death and wickedness and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, people go into these things and they get themselves in this fervor, in this emotional condition, and they are very susceptible to do just about anything you want them to through this wicked music. That's why I recommend being very careful with what kind of music you and your children listen to. all this heavy metal and death metal and evil stuff. Christians have no business listening to that stuff. Just listen to that. Just, does that sound, just your sense of discernment should tell you. You shouldn't need anything else, just your simple sense of discernment. Does that sound like godly music? No, it doesn't sound like godly music at all. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul or Jesus Christ or Peter or John or the early churches getting together and listening to death metal, heavy metal, like that kind of stuff, rap, all this wicked garbage? No, obviously not. All this screaming and insanity. Christians should not be listening to that garbage. But it gets people into an emotional state. It's almost as if it opens up their minds to be influenced by Satan. Satan knows what he's doing with music. Now, if that didn't work, so you had the music to get them, to get their emotions going, to get them to go along with the crowd. But if that didn't work, then there's always the threat of death. That would be the backup plan. This was to encourage them to worship. Verse 6, I'll read it again. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Satan will use this same strategy when he sets up a world government and a world religion. So he threatens people with death if you don't worship him. And we read about this in Revelation 13 in verse 15. Revelation 13 and verse 15. It says, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Whatever that image of the beast is, whether it's an image like Nebuchadnezzar set up or it's something spiritual or something, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, people that won't worship it are going to be killed. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Satan did the same thing back in Nebuchadnezzar's days. He'll do it at the end of time, it looks like. Now when the music started playing, all the people from every nation and language under Nebuchadnezzar's dominion fell down and worshipped his idol. Daniel 3 and verse 7. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. They hear the music, and they all bow down, everybody together. What Nebuchadnezzar basically had created here was a one-world religion. Look at what it says. That's what it says, right? It says, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped. All the people of all the nations and languages of the world, all together, worshipping an idol. This is a one-world religion by definition. Satan's been trying this forever. He has been continually setting up world empires and world governments trying to bring the world together under one system and one religion to worship him. The Lord keeps destroying them. He had Egypt for a while, the Lord destroyed Egypt. Then he had Assyria for a while, the Lord destroyed Assyria. We've read about that in the scripture. Then Babylon takes over and he destroys Babylon with the Medes and the Persians. Then the Lord destroys them with the Greeks, Alexander the Great. And then the Lord destroys the Greek Empire with the Roman Empire. And then the gospel kingdom comes along, which is that stone that was cut out without hands, and it smashes that Roman Empire to 1,000,000 pieces. Satan keeps trying to build up these world empires, and the Lord keeps smashing them down. Now, he will be successful in building one at the end of time. Actually, 2 of them. At the 7th and the 8th. Who knows? We could be living under one of them right now. I think the U.S. Empire could very well be one of the heads of the beast. Possibly the 7th. Nebuchadnezzar was imitating Lucifer, who wanted to be like the Most High and be worshipped by all men. Let's turn back to Isaiah 14, 12 through 14. Isaiah 14, 12 through 14. The heads of states have satanic angels behind them. You know, we read about the prince of Persia, the prince of Grecia in the book of Daniel, and the angel said to Daniel, spoke of Michael, your prince. Michael was the prince of the nation of Israel. These other empires have principalities, have angelic beings that are animating them and inspiring their leaders. And Satan, no doubt, was inspiring Nebuchadnezzar to do this very thing, to set up this one world religion. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar can get glory from it. He gets something out of it. But who's really getting the glory? Satan's getting the glory, because the whole world in this case is worshiping a devil, is worshiping this idol instead of the true God. This has been Satan's plan and desire from the very beginning. This is what got him cast out of heaven way back in the beginning of the creation. Isaiah 14:12 through 14. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. This was his goal. Now, when I say Satan was behind the king of Babylon, I'm not even speculating about that. Because, look at verse 4. Isaiah 14 and verse 4. That thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? And you go on down, and who's he speaking to behind that king of Babylon? Lucifer. That's who was behind this whole thing. Satan was behind this whole one world religion. And everybody was doing it except for 3 men. 3 men held out. 3 men said, no, I will not do this. But we'll get to that in a minute. Turn to Matthew 4 and verse 9. I'm going to show you that this is Satan's aspiration, to have all men fall down and worship him. This is what he tried to get the Son of God to do, was to fall down and worship him. If he could have gotten the Son of God, he had us all. Matthew 4 and verse 9. And saith unto him, all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. That's Satan speaking to Jesus. Jesus would have none of it. Then saith Jesus unto him, get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. That would have been a verse that these 3 children could have quoted to Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't. We don't read about it. But they could have. They had the law of Moses. They could have said, hey, we're not serving your gods. We serve the Lord God only. Look at 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 4. I'll show you that this is what Satan's going to try to pull off at the end of time. He's going to be sitting in the temple of God, whatever that is, as God, being worshipped as God. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 4. This is speaking of the man of sin, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. All these empires that he had set up were all stepping stones to this final empire where he'll have all the world, or just about all the world, worshiping him. That's his ultimate goal. And we, brethren, need to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, and not go along with it. I'll give you one more. Revelation 13, 3 through 4. Revelation 13, 3 through 4. It doesn't matter if the penalty is death. We must stand fast in our convictions and our faith. Revelation 13, 3 through 4. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. This is speaking of the beast. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? You got a one world religion, and you got a one world military, one world empire here. The beast. And the beast is inspired by the dragon. The dragon is Satan. That old serpent called the devil and Satan, we're told. I'll give you that verse here. It's in, well, I thought it was in Revelation 12. Yeah, verse 9. I knew it was. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels cast out with him. Just wanted to show you that the dragon there in Revelation 13 is the devil. Now, it's interesting that Satan has his religion set up, and he uses music to entice men to participate in it. And he's been doing this forever. His religion has always had musical instruments in it. Look at Revelation 18 and verse 22. We'll read about Mystery Babylon. Which Mystery Babylon is Satan's religion? It certainly encompasses the Roman Catholic Church, is a large part of that. The Roman Catholic Church has had musical instruments in it for a long, long time. Revelation 18 and verse 22, it says, And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in thee, and no craftsman of whatsoever craft he be shall be found any more in thee, and the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more at all in thee. Now, this says there's going to be no more instruments in her. The point that I wanted to get was Mystery Babylon had a lot of instruments in her. When she's destroyed, she won't, but for a long time, she has. Satan's religion has always been one of musical instrumentation. Now here's a quote from Matthew Henry, which I thought was quite good. He was commenting on Daniel chapter 3. He said, Here were the charms of music to allure them into a compliance, and the terrors of the fiery furnace to frighten them into a compliance. Note that the way that way that sense directs the most will go. There is nothing so bad which the careless world will not be drawn to by a concert of music, or driven to by a fiery furnace. And by such methods as these, false worship has been set up and maintained. Very true. Take away the music program from every church in this country, and those churches would close their doors the next Sunday. Guarantee it. Take away the music program. Take away the musical instruments. And the majority of those churches would close up. And if they didn't, they would be dwindled down to such a small number, they'd have to sell off their buildings and they'd all be bankrupted. And it would be a huge upheaval of the religion in this country if you just did that one thing, got rid of the musical instruments. This is how Satan sets up false religion. Musical instruments and the threat of hell if you don't do what I say. That's how he sets up his religions. Well, getting back to this devil worship here, there were some busybodies that were around, if you can imagine that, and they reported to Nebuchadnezzar that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not serve his gods and worship his golden image. Back to Daniel chapter 3, 8 through 12. Daniel chapter 3, 8 through 12. Back to that music thing. There is a reason, and it's not forgetfulness, why God did not put musical instruments in the New Testament church. He knows about musical instruments. Remember, we did a 4-part series here, a year or so ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, I can't remember, on musical instruments in the church. And there aren't any, of course. There were in the Old Testament. Now, God didn't ordain them. God ordained 2 horns, or a horn that was to be used twice to call the congregation to assembly and to call them to war. That was the only instrument that God himself ever commanded. All the rest of them were added by David. God rubber stamped it, just like he did divorce law and other things that he never intended from the beginning. But God never commanded all these instruments. Not in the Old Testament, And he certainly never commanded any in the New Testament because there aren't any. We went through in that series and we looked at every single place an instrument appears in the New Testament in any form. And never once is an instrument used in the New Testament church. Never. And there's a reason for that. Because Satan uses musical instruments to control, to take over people's emotions and to cause them to worship him through that means. God does not want things that are going to pull on your heartstrings unless they're things of truth. God wants the truth to draw your heart to him. God doesn't want the nice, sweet sound of instruments that are going to play to your flesh to draw you to him. I'm convinced that's why he doesn't have musical instruments. He just has singing. And what does singing do? Singing is instructive. When we sing, we teach each other in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. We praise God with our words, which mean something, not with sounds of an instrument that don't mean anything. All right, anyway, back to the busybodies. Daniel chapter 3, 8 through 12. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And Nebi says, yeah, I remember that. Yep, I did that. Verse 12. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Just like some little 5-year-old tattletale saying, but these guys didn't do it. They were supposed to be worshiping and they didn't show up. Oh, king, got to get them in trouble. Busybodies. That's what these people are. Now, no offense to our sister. She has no control over the name that her mother gave her. But these people are called Karens today. Have you ever heard this term, Karens? These are the people that turn you in for not wearing a mask. Right? The Karens. They see somebody in a business and the business isn't informing the mass and they call up the local authorities and tell on them. I don't know why they're called Karens. I never looked that up. I feel bad for poor Karen. But anyway, don't feel bad, Karen. You know what the little thing is when you go to vote and you poke the hole down and it gets that little piece of paper that's poked out? You know what that's called? A Chad. Right. And in 2000, I remember hearing about pregnant Chads, dangling Chads. You remember all that stuff? Remember that? That whole controversy down in Florida with all the old people that can't push the thing hard enough. And my nickname at one place that I worked when I was in college was Dangling Chad. Yeah. These people, though, these Karens, these busybodies, these people are far more dangerous than government agents. Way more dangerous. There are only so many government agents. They can only patrol so many stores. They can only be watching over so many people. But Karens are everywhere. And government agents are wearing uniforms, unless they're undercover or something. You know, when you see a police officer, you know to behave, right? I mean, you should be behaving anyway, but you know to behave when you see a cop, right? You don't know who the Karens are. You walk around, you do something, you know, you don't have your mask on or whatever, and before you know it, they're calling up the health department. Far more dangerous than government agents. Busybodies are evil people and are for good reason classified with murderers. Look at 1 Peter 4 and verse 15. I always wondered about this, why busybodies were classified with such ungodly sinners. And, I mean, I knew that busybodies were just, I mean, they're bad people, and they really cause havoc in people's lives, and people that are getting involved in things that are none of their business and all that. But then it dawned on me, I see now why Peter's lumping them with murderers, because busybodies actually murder people, or actually cause people's death, or try to. And these people here and with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were literally trying to murder them by telling on them, by being busybodies. Look at 1 Peter 4 and verse 15. 1 Peter 4 and verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Murderer, thief, evildoer. And think about that. I mean, it doesn't get a whole lot worse than a murderer. I can think of a few things that would be worse, but I mean that's really bad. Thieves. You remember that the guys that were crucified on either side of Jesus Christ were two thieves, right? I mean, these are bad people, right? Evildoers. That pretty much encompasses all manner of sin, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Peter says, don't be killing people, don't be stealing their stuff, don't be doing evil things, and don't be getting involved in things that's none of your business. That's really something, huh? Because people like that cause a lot of problems. You know, it's busybodies like that can have you put in prison, that can have your life destroyed, that can make you lose your job, lose your kids. Right? How many busybodies have turned in parents to children and youth services or these agencies because they think the parents aren't doing what they should, or they're spanking their children or whatever? I know people that's happened to. I have to think about it. I know at least a couple of different families that's happened to. That's evil. So mind your own business. Unless human life is in clear and present danger, mind your own business. It's one thing. I mean, if you know parents that are literally starving their children to death on purpose, that are beating them bloody, right? That are, when there is legitimate child abuse happening, or you know somebody's planning to kill somebody, and they're not just saying, oh man, I want to kill that guy. Right? I mean, they literally are planning to kill somebody. Then you can step in. Then you can call the authorities. But mind your own business. If you see people doing something that you don't really think is a good idea, or you don't agree, or I wonder what my neighbors are up to, they just look like they're up to no good. Mind your own business. Unless you know what's going on, mind your own business. Because we're not to be busybodies. And furthermore, it's a good way to get yourself hurt. And he that passeth by and meddleth with strife that belongeth not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. It's a good way to get yourself in trouble. Well, back to Nebuchadnezzar, he was furious, in a rage, when he learned of their refusal to worship his golden image. You see, you could add this to the list of the things that are never satisfied. You know, the Scripture says there are 4 things that are never satisfied. Another one is a king that wants to be worshipped by the whole world. He's got hundreds of thousands, millions of people, the entire world pretty much bowing down to worship. 3 guys don't bow down, and he is in a rage. It's funny how people are. But boy, you offend somebody's pride and you will feel their wrath. Daniel 3 and verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. And this just shows you too, boy, the king that you had great favor with, like 10 minutes ago, you are now an object of his wrath. It didn't take any time at all. Now, in case you didn't know this, it is a perilous condition to be the object of a king's wrath. I'm just going to give you a bunch of verses about this in Proverbs. We'll just run through these ones quickly. Proverbs 14 and verse 35. Proverbs 14 and verse 35. You turn to Proverbs 14:35. I just had another thought that I want to share with you. Just to clarify something I said, because I don't want you, when I said to mind your own business, that does not mean that you do not intervene when you need to intervene to save somebody's life or save somebody from bodily harm or something like that. I'll just read you a verse. Proverbs 24:11 through 12. If thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death, and those that are ready to be slain, if thou sayest, Behold, we knew it not, doth not he that pondereth the heart consider it? And he that keepeth thy soul, doth not he know it? And shall not he render to every man according to his works? So you see somebody that's being delivered to be slain, somebody that, you see some guy pulling some woman into a van or something like that, and she's screaming, you better do something about it. But when you don't know and you just maybe have suspicion or something, just mind your own business. But when the proof is there, then it's time to act. All right, anyway. Proverbs 14 and verse 35. It says, the king's favor is toward a wise servant until he won't bow down to his idol. But his wrath is against him that causeth shame. Now in this case, they didn't cause any shame, except maybe to Nebuchadnezzar, because maybe he looks a little ashamed because here are these piddly little Jews that aren't bowing down to my statue. And boy, when other people start seeing this, they're going to follow suit. And before you know it, my one world religion is only going to be a half world religion, and that is unacceptable. Look at Proverbs 16 and verse 14. The wrath of a king is as messengers of death, but a wise man will pacify it. Now you get the king mad at you, especially in the days when the king was the judge, jury, and executioner. That's a bad place to be. It's as messengers of death. You get him mad, it's like the executioner's coming for you. You better be careful. And a wise man will pacify it. You better walk softly. You better speak humbly. You don't want to start mouthing off to the king. Look at Proverbs 19 and verse 12. Just like the police officer. You get pulled over by a police officer, you better be nice. Yes, sir, no, sir. You better just fess up to whatever you did. Don't come up with some excuse. The speedometer's not working. Then you get a speeding ticket and you'll get a ticket for not having a speedometer that's not working right. Proverbs 19 and verse 12. The king's wrath is as the roaring of a lion, but his favor is as dew upon the grass. The Bible says the lion is strongest among beasts and turneth not away for any. It says Satan is a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. The king's wrath is the roaring of a lion. I've never heard a lion roar in the wild anyway, but I guarantee you, when you hear a lion roar in the wild, you're going to be smelling a nasty smell in a second too. It's going to be coming from your own pants. You don't want to mess with a king or a lion. And then Esther 7 through 10. I'll just give you an example here of a king that of a man that provoked the wrath of the king, and it didn't go well for him. This was the man Haman. We're going to be talking about Haman here. Not too long in this series. It might be a few more weeks or so. We're going to be looking at Haman and looking at how the Jews were delivered from national destruction. But anyway, in Esther 7 through 10, you remember what happened. Haman came up with this plot to murder all the Jews because, once again, it comes down to worship. Mordecai would not bow down to him, and he couldn't deal with that. And Mordecai was a Jew, so he couldn't figure out how he was going to kill Mordecai, I guess. So he just figured, I'll just kill them all. And he got the king to sign this decree, which says, there's just these pesky people in the kingdom. He didn't bother to tell him who he was, and that his wife, the king's wife, was one of them. But there are these pesky people, and they got their own laws, and they don't go with the program. We just need to exterminate them. Just get rid of them. And the king says, okay, yeah, no problem. Go ahead. Well, Esther, the queen, finds out about this plot. She's a Jew, and she's not happy about that. She goes to the king, and she exposes this whole thing at this banquet. Well, Haman is really afraid. In verse 6, Esther 7 and verse 6, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went out into the palace garden. Now, I have to give it to the king. I think he was wise here. Instead of just killing Haman or flying off the handle, he went out into the garden. And I'm assuming he went out there to take a few breaths, to compose himself, because he was really angry. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. And he saw that there was, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. He could see the look on the king's face, and he wasn't very happy. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. That was a bad idea. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Where the word of a king is, there is power. All he had to say, a rhetorical question, will he take the queen also? Cover that guy's face. He is going to die. In Harbona, one of the chamberlains said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Yep. His wrath wasn't going to be pacified until that Haman was dead. This is how Nebuchadnezzar was feeling. He was very, very angry. His wrath and his rage were kindled. You see, regular people can control their wrath probably better than a king, because regular people have to control their wrath better than a king. There might be some guy that you make so mad that he's a child of hell. He would kill you in a heartbeat if he could. If there were no consequences whatsoever, he would kill you. Wouldn't even think twice about it. There's probably lots of politicians out there, a lot of people out there that would kill us if they had an opportunity, because they hate us. A lot of skeptics and people that hate God hate us. They would kill us if they could. But there's law, and there's punishment, and there's judgment, and there are consequences. And most people then can control their wrath. They may get mad, and they may get red-faced, and they may scream and yell, and rant, rave, yell, scream, and holler, all that stuff. But they're not going to kill you, because they can't. Because they value their life more than they hate yours. But the king's a different story. The king, in those days, he could do whatever he wants. You offend the king, he'll kill you. So it's really, really dangerous, especially in those days, to do something like that, because there is no check on the king's wrath, no check on his rage. But regardless of that, godly men cannot fear the wrath of the king. Look at Hebrews 11 and verse 27. Hebrews 11 verse 27. Moses likewise stood up against the king of the most powerful empire in the world at that time, the empire of Egypt. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood up against Nebuchadnezzar, Moses stood up against the Pharaoh, and he told the Pharaoh, which was the king of Egypt, to let my people go. That Pharaoh could have killed him. I often wondered about that. Why didn't Pharaoh just kill Moses? Obviously, God wouldn't let him, right? But I would just assume that if Pharaoh could have just done whatever he wanted to, and God didn't restrain him, well, just kill Moses. Why would you let this guy come back and, plague after plague after plague, and just kill him, right? Kill him, kill Aaron, kill whoever you had to. But the Lord wasn't going to let that happen. But anyway, Moses was not afraid of the king. Hebrews 11 and verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Moses chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Verses 25 and 26. And because of that, he forsook Egypt, and he did not fear the wrath of the king. He was the king's step-grandson. He was the son of Pharaoh's daughter, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He grew up in the palace. And yet he forsook Egypt and didn't fear that wrath and forsook everything because he wanted to be with the people of God. That's what we must be. We must not fear what man can do unto us. We must fear God. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 28 and 29. Hebrews 12, 28 and 29. Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Now you fear God. Don't fear the king. Don't fear men. Fear God. Because those who fear men will be snared. Proverbs 29 and verse 25. Proverbs 29 and verse 25. It says, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. In this case, the fear of the Lord would have brought the snare of idolatry and false religion to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that happens with other people. Because people fear men. They fear their parents. They fear their families. They fear the ostracization that they'll get. And they go along with the family religion. They won't break apart from it. They won't leave the idolatry, the false religion, because they fear the family. It'll bring a snare. We must rather trust in God and not fear what man can do unto us. This will be the last verse for today, and then we'll pick up and, Lord willing, finish this part on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego next week. Psalm 56, 1 through 4. Psalm 56, 1 through 4. This is a psalm of David. He says, be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresseth me. Mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O thou most high. What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee. You think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were afraid? I bet you they were. I bet you they were. You think they had a bit of a lump in their throat, butterflies in their stomach, as the whole empire was worshiping that thing and they were standing there? Everybody else is bowing down and they're standing up? I've been there before. It's not a big deal, but I've told you before, I personally don't say the Pledge of Allegiance because I'm not pledging allegiance to an evil government and flag and all that kind of thing. But anyway, I stand there, and everybody else says it. I stand there in city council meetings or Chamber of Commerce meetings and different meetings that I've been to.